as you know, I don't do a lot of talk about political issues and things like that because sometimes I think it's a lot of show, it's a lot of distraction, and frankly, not always that relevant to what we try to do. But I think what we have to do sometimes, and we understand what it is we're dealing with, what kind of system we're up against when the government comes to you with some claim or some order or something that they want you to do, they're coming with a certain amount of legal authority, hopefully. But we've argued for years that, statutes aren't law and things like that. I think it's more, it's that's unclear to most people. So I think you need to understand what drives the system to where it is and what might be changing in the near future. But also, it's going to take an educational process to get there. It's also going to take you individually filing in certain things and making a position that's kind of new. I mean, you may see some of our material begin to change as this evolves. Our materials changed quite a few times over the years. The video you saw 6 or 7 years ago, we may not really be covering that because we found that either the courts have sort of found a way around it or the system, because the system is always working to beat those who wake up. That's what it does. Um, like for example, one thing that happened to try to beat down somebody who wakes up is just take, whether you support Trump or whoever you support, I'm just trying to use them as an example. Clearly, it's a political attack across the board, starting with the fake, the hiding Hunter Biden's laptop, which turned out to be true. It wasn't a Russian, and it's like the deep state exposed itself because they were saying it was all Russian intel thing, and all these people signed off on it, and then it turned out not to be true. I mean, it just blatantly not true. There really was a laptop, and the stuff was really happening. The real things that he did happen. So uh, that was like a real obvious exposure of the deep state, as it's called, the administrative state, and their power to create media and confusion to cover up corruption. And then it just continued on. They said, we're going to get Trump on day one. All these different politicians, the guy from New York, the lady from Florida, just the DOJ in general, where many people were saying, we're going to get him, we're going to get him, we're going to get him. No, they hadn't been charged with a crime. And in our system, ladies and gentlemen, there must be a crime to investigate, not someone to investigate, see if they committed a crime. That's just not how it works. We've got it backwards. But you saw what they did to Trump, and they tried everything and treatments, lawsuits. They tried the criminal charges on charges that have never even been used that way before. Why? Because they're so vague. And we're going to get into that. What could change about that? But all these things have led up to these crazy times. And I contribute that most of what we're dealing with right now in our modern time is this administrative state. Some call it the deep state. I really do call it the administrative state because it is a sort of self-declared fourth branch of government that unless you're noticing that it's there, it's going to operate. And it might get you because you act like it doesn't exist. Because a lot of people say, oh, that's not true. That's a conspiracy theory. No, there is a Department of Justice. There is a FBI. There is an IRS. There is an EPA. These are agencies that operate under regulations. This has really become the light in this new Chevron deference case that we talked about recently. Okay. So I want you to understand that a lot of this is stemming. I mean, we can go way all the way back to talk about how this happened over time. But the reality is it was about 50 years ago when this began to really, really take off because of some things like the Chevron case back then. Okay. But I even blame the assassination attempt on it. I'm not saying that it was an inside job, although I can't. Some things are so obvious it's hard to explain, which is why they fired the lady today. But she was also one of those DEI hires, which means uh, uh, equity and inclusion. I forgot. I don't even like the term, but anyway, but it has to do with these new theories that they have about they have to create this sort of equality amongst everybody. Okay. And rather than going for the best. And now we're starting to see the consequences of not getting the best people. Okay. And diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sorry, the word slipped my mind. Now, I'm not saying anything against women. I've met many women very, very capable of doing their jobs that have no problem with that. It just shouldn't be forced into the system like they just did. And it looks like we're about to get a vice president on the same basis, or a new president, maybe, if Kamala gets elected. She was chosen. Biden said before he chose her, I will be choosing a black woman or a woman of color. Okay, well, what does that have to do with picking the best person? And we should all be very afraid of that because that's what led to this situation with Trump and the assassination attempt. It was that sort of thinking, and it creates incompetency. Do we want, first of all, we just had it with Trump. Do we want it on the whole country? You really want to question that, okay? So the assassination attempt probably really did happen through a combination of things. It's obviously immediate affecting an individual. He was very conveniently pretty much allowed right up onto that roof as people looked the other way. Um, got his shots off, then got his head blown off immediately. So there's no evidence. I mean, it was just too convenient. I don't know. As Steve Bannon says, I don't believe in conspiracies. I just don't believe in too many coincidences. And there were a lot of coincidences that day. But I say that if it's just incompetency, it's incompetency because we have allowed these agencies to self-empower with these fake rules that aren't laws that don't do any good to the American public. Now, we have another area called legal reform that's been pushed, and it was started with Trump, actually, but it wasn't completed. In fact, they kind of went the other way. This has to do with people going to jail because um, a lot of people are languishing in jail. J6ers, people from January 6th, and several other people that I do know personally. Unfortunately, the system still got them no matter what because they have these broad little technicalities they can get people on and they set you up to fail. I'll talk about Steve Navarro here in a minute, but and there's two cases that are examples of what's coming to you if you don't get this. And this is how the system works against you. But this fourth branch of government is dangerous because let's just use an example. And I heard a really good, there's a new book out. I wish I had the title. I don't have it with me, but it's all about this guy that's an insider that knows all about the fourth branch of government, which is all of these agencies and how they now have begun to control the politicians who control the purse strings, who write the laws to give those agencies power. So it's this circular power structure that exists. You can deny it all you want, but if you just look at how it works, you'll see how it works. I think it was even Adam Schiff came on not that long ago and said, look, you need to understand the power of these agencies. If they want you, they can get you 1,000 different ways. So he was talking about as a politician, the people who work for him and work for us can get them to do what they want them to do, if that makes sense. That's a new power structure in our country we didn't have 50 years ago. And Eisenhower talked about the risk of the military industrial complex. And then it just kind of started. These agencies began to grow. And again, that Chevron deference rule said, well, hey, leave it up to the agencies. They can just kind of write their interpretation of the rules, and then that'll effectively be the law. Well, unfortunately, that ain't how it really works. Unfortunately, now those rules have just been changed by this recent Supreme Court case. So what's going to happen? You know, we're in this crazy world now. We have what I call rainbow Marxism. That's the rainbow flags. It's an anti-Christ flag. I can give you there's a ton of background on this, but I can't get into that now. The point is, if it's not for Christ and our rights, which is our freedoms, then it's anti-Christ. That's the sign of the Antichrist, in my opinion. You may say I'm crazy. I'm just telling you, it's the movement. I don't want to insult any of our uh, gay friends. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about that movement that's meant to indoctrinate and make us believe that anti-Christ things are good. And then we start to accept this enslavement the system's putting over us. And we don't have to. That American flag still does mean something. I still think it does. I'm a veteran. I believe in it. I don't believe in some of the causes we've had to fight for, but I believe that the people believe they're doing something good for the country, and that's generally true. But behind all that are the banksters, the banking cartels. And I call them that because it really did start in 19, was, I forgot when was the Creature from Jekyll Island story, but I think it was 1906 or 13. No, and then they had 1913, they had the first Federal Reserve acts and things like that developing. So the point is this was a developing process. Read the book Creature from Jekyll Island. You'll get the whole story. I've still got a copy on my shelf, and I personally know Ed Griffin. I met him years and years ago before he became a big deal. But it talks about how the banksters really began to control the economy. And in 1933, when it collapsed, They created the New Deal. And the New Deal was to say, let's tell you what, just turn over all the property to us as collateral, and we'll give you an endless supply of money to borrow and run the government on. And it's an inflationary system automatically because you can never actually pay it back because the interest is more than they ever print. How can you pay that back? So it's a perpetual debt system. But gradually that crept its way into the Department of Justice, the military, and it gives them all these big budgets and money they can spend and power. The Chevron deference case, I'm telling you, gives you the ability to push back on a whole lot of that. Um, so, but how do you do it is the question. And we're going to find out. I don't know offhand. We can talk about it. I'd like to hear your ideas about, like, for example, if an agency comes to you and says, hey, you need to mow your lawn, well, you have to ask, is that a constitutional question? Or did they just write that rule, okay, without constitutional authority? Or if it's I don't know, they're saying you got to drive electric cars. Well, guess what? All that is unconstitutional. It already is getting challenged. The Green New Deal, taking trillions of dollars, printing it, and putting it all into this junk technology that's going to take care of itself. That stuff will develop on its own. You don't have to spend all that money on it. But it does also sucks up more this debt that they've created. And the more they create, the more reasons they got to create more criminals because they know you're going to get pissed. So if they make you a felony, they take your guns away. That's a good way to get a whole bunch of guns off the street. If they get you into a prison environment where you get a record, you're nearly impossible to survive, economically speaking, after they do that. So they control you even more. And they use this money system, which drives, I believe, the court system and the Department of Justice and all these other agencies to continually to self-survive until we get that weapon of using what's left of the Supreme Court and this tool to challenge whether those things that they're imposing upon you are even lawful. Because if they're not actually clearly written into the law, or a court hasn't clarified the rule, those two things, you can challenge it. So we're going to have to get good at how to challenge these agencies, and it's not to create chaos. It's to just ensure that they're following the law. That statute has to be clear enough that they don't need to write their own regulations and then tell you what the law is. Because I can tell you they're doing it at all levels. The one we deal with the most, of course, all of us, is probably Department of Transportation and the IRS. DMV is kind of connected to the Department of Transportation. IRS is obviously the department related to many state agencies who also collect taxes. So the question you always have to ask is, where's not just the regulation that says you, not living in the District of Columbia, have to pay or file, but now there's also the issue of the implementing regulations that never were there. But see, before that would always be a losing argument because the lower courts gigantically are corrupt. They're going to rule in favor of the government 99% of the time because you really didn't have a weapon. But I think now we're going to have a new tool to bring up because there can be a constitutional challenge to that. Not saying the IRS is not constitutional. I'm not saying that any of that kind of stuff. People make those arguments that always falls on deaf ears. I'm talking about whether they actually had regulatory authority to enforce it against you. And that can be challenged. And so on. And there's many other things like that are going to happen, mostly at the federal level. But I've had a few people bring up, well, it could also be at the state level too, because many state agencies are actually connected to the Fed. And again, if they're enforcing a regulation, or if they bring up a statute, but they're acting under their regulations, again, there's that break there. That's something you can look at. Okay. Remember there's a couple of books I think everybody should read if you really want to get an idea I'm not trying to make you a legal expert. I'm just trying to give you a foundation to understand what's going on, how the system is being pushed and driven. You won't be surprised by these antichrist or bankster movements or this fourth branch of government, why these things come about, and then they make you the demon for standing up to it. Well, no, wait a minute, this is wrong. Okay. So the books are 3 Felonies a Day and License to Lie. I should have put quotes around there, but they're down here on the bottom of the screen. 3 Felonies a Day and License to Lie. I strongly recommend you read those. They'll talk to you about real world cases where the administrative state has gotten out of control. And then they use the DOJ and the corrupt courts to do it. Now, here's the thing about if you go to a federal court specifically, um, you'll probably lose if you're dealing with the government. However, that's not the point. The point is if you, because they're not going to always rule they're rarely going to rule in your favor. However, if you get this new tool that we're talking about developing using the Chevron deference, that they were out of their authority, boy, that's a biggie. And now we can do something with that. Once they see that you have an appealable case, in other words, you put the right documents in, you have an appealable case, that's when they start paying attention. That's when you win a lower court case because they go, oops, I'm going to lose on appeal. And they generally don't like that. So if you don't build a case that's appealable within their rules, I'm not going around saying, I'm a sovereign, I glow in the dark, I'm all that kind of stuff. I'm talking about just they're breaking the rules. Put the burden of proof on them. Well, that you can do that. And these books just give you an example of how broadly they use these powers. And also why they say we can indict a ham sandwich if we want to. Well, Donald Trump is a ham sandwich. Okay. They found anything and everything they could. And now he's a felon. Well, it's just a title, right? He's actually using it to his advantage. Again, I'm not trying to go pro-Trump on you. I'm not anti either, but it's just I see what's happened and I know it's wrong. That's all. Because if they can do it to him, they can do it to you, and that's true. The other couple of guys you should look up are Peter Navarro and Steve Bannon. Now, these guys worked for Trump. They also indicted them as hand sandwiches. And what they did with them is they demanded they come in, violate their oath of office by demanding they testify on protected information. Because, when a president speaks, they do have to have some things that are protected because otherwise they won't feel free to make certain decisions. I think they got to have that power. But the Peter Navarro and Steve Bannon were basically brought on contempt of Congress, whatever that means. And it means that, they said, no, I can't come and speak about this. I'm under, attorney-client privilege, things like that. And now I think they made a mistake. They should have just gone and said, I invoke the fifth and I'm done. At least they would have shown up. You can still do that in these kind of situations. You should always use that. But they went ahead and they issued a bunch of papers saying, no, we don't have a duty to show up, yada, yada, yada. The Congress went ahead and recommended them for criminal indictment. DOJ, just being subservient, went ahead and did it because they knew they could make examples of these guys. I'm going to prove to you that they were examples. It's real simple. They both come out and said there wasn't another person in these federal prisons they were put in. They were only in there for like 4 months. Well, Steve Bannon's still in there, but Peter just came out. You can go look at him up on the internet. But he was in there for 4 months. He says there were no other people in there that ever brought to the level of being put in a federal prison for a misdemeanor of that nature. Not even close. Everybody else were felons. Okay. But for them, they made exceptions. Peter Navarro and Steve Bannon are hated by the deep staters because they speak up about it. They talk about it. And that's what happens when you're too big of a voice and you speak up against the deep state. But both these guys to me are patriots because they said, you know what, put me in jail. They're going to be fine. And if for a misdemeanor, they're put into a federal prison. That almost never happens. Usually there's an ankle bracelet or probation or something like that. No, in their case, they made exceptions. If that's not political crime, I don't know what it is. And guys, they're doing it to everybody at every level. It's just they're getting so used to doing it and getting away with it. So they tried everything against Trump, blah, 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 blah. It leads to, you could almost say, and the final thing they tried was an assassination attempt. I don't know that's the case. A lot of people believe that. It's not really that productive to even engage in it. But here's the thing. It's not, it's a natural extension of what this could all lead to, which is chaos. We don't want that. So we have to start taking down these things because all these things lead to a weaker country, a weaker system. Our core system is a joke. If they can do all these things and get away with it, until you stand up, which is why we created URLaw, urlaw.org. We did this for you guys to start to study yourself. I should have typed this on here because, in case any outsiders see this. But you guys are the ones with all the power. You really are. Until you volunteer, which means you give up or you sign a contract. So many people are in trouble because they sign an agreement. Well, they're acting unconstitutionally towards me. Well, did you sign something? Did you enter an agreement? That may be what's causing your problem. So be careful what you sign.